What's up, bros and besties? Welcome to another episode of Bitches Love Sports. I'm your host, Jazz Monet, and I am here on the heels of the Christian Parker press conference, the introductory press conference that took place not too long ago. So, welcome, Mr. Parker. We've been expecting you. If you know anything about Cowboys Nation and the Cowboys fan base, you know one of the, I guess you could call it a test that new coaches and new members of the staff are put through is how they deal with the media. And not only the media, but also the fact that the media, as well as content creators, both who are affiliated as well as independent, are going to put your work, your statements, everything under a microscope, and it's going to be discussed. So, even though we've talked about Christian Parker before on this show, this is my official welcome to Cowboys Nation, Mr. Parker. So, the press conference was really interesting. And as usual, let me know if you can hear me. I think you can. I think I got the sound right today. Y'all know sometimes I get started and then we find out there are technical issues, but I think I got it right today for y'all. So I took a few minutes after the press conference to pick out a few timestamps just to give y'all my initial impression on what we heard and what we saw from Christian Parker. So, hey, JV, good to see you in the chat. And I did see you in the chat earlier, Royal. Royal, thanks for sharing how your day went. I didn't know you were Catholic. I'm not Catholic, but I grew up in Louisiana, so I know a little bit about the Ash Wednesday tradition. So I don't know if Happy Ash Wednesday is the phrase, but if it is, Happy Ash Wednesday to you and those who celebrate. I forgot to say Happy Mardi Gras yesterday. That's how stressed I've been that like Mardi Gras came and went and I didn't even mention it. But we'll get to that another time. Today, we want to talk about Christian Parker and what he told us about what he's bringing to the table in terms.
I guess this counts as lunch for next week, right?
Oh,
So I have
shit.
to buy you
Hold on.
guys lunch. I got to buy lunch again?
I did not mean to start that just then. Anyway. But yeah, we're going to talk about what he's bringing to the table, especially when it comes to the expectations that people had versus what he clarified in this particular press conference, especially when it comes to what he's going to do as far as bringing things that he learned from Vic Fangio. And I'll go ahead and give y'all a spoiler on that. One of the things that Brian Schottenheimer said during this press conference was he's not Vic. He's not Vic. He just put it out there, blanket statement. He's not Vic. At one point, he was asked what he learned from Vic Fangio and basically said that it was too much to cover in one press conference. And he did talk about what he might do in terms of formation and in terms of how he plans to use the players. And I do have a few timestamps for those things. Now, I only jotted down like 5, so we might not get to the best ones today. That's why I always tell y'all, make sure that you're subscribed, hit the like button, turn the notifications on, because if I come back on Friday, that means I listen to this again and I'm like, yo, we need to go over some of this stuff again. But today we do have some of what I think are the best sound bites. But I'm going to start with the beginning. Without any sound, one of the first things that people noticed was that Jerry Jones, Stephen Jones, not there. We have a press conference with just Schotty and Christian Parker. And by the way, Schotty referred to him as CP a lot during this press conference. So I think that's something that we're going to hear several times throughout the season. I feel like that's his nickname, CP. So welcome, CP. But it was something that was brought up in the chat that people noticed that Jerry Jones and Stephen Jones were not there. And Jane Slater asked about it. And it was pointed out that when Matt Eberflus was introduced, Jerry Jones and Stephen Jones weren't there either. But I'm going to come to Jane Slater's defense on this one because here's what I think she was picking up on. When Matt Eberflus had his introductory press conference, that happened at the combine. That I don't know if it was impromptu, and it probably wasn't. The Cowboys typically don't let the press just walk up to their coaches and talk to them. So it definitely wasn't impromptu in the sense that cameras just found him and the Cowboys published it, but it felt impromptu in the sense that it was against the wall. It seemed like maybe it was happening in some hallway somewhere at the combine. It wasn't a sit down press conference like this. And so I feel like that's what Jane was picking up on. The fact that when it was Matt Eberflus, it did kind of feel like, well, let's find some time while we're at the combine. We're going to talk to you and then let you get back to work. This, however, it was scheduled. It was planned. You can tell it's taking place in the Cowboys' designated press conference room. And so it is a little bit of a different vibe for Jerry and Steven to not show up for something that was planned in advance like this. you know? So I feel like she had a good reason for pointing out what she pointed out and saying what she said, that like, yo, this is a different vibe for something like this. You would expect to see Stephen Jones and Jerry Jones at the table with them, and we didn't. And so what does that mean? Schotty said it doesn't mean anything. Schotty said don't read into it. He like at first I think he thought that Jane was trying to suggest that the Joneses weren't excited about the hire. And he was like, no, they're excited. Like, we are so excited about Christian Parker. We're happy he's here. And then she went back and clarified. And then he was like, oh no, I wouldn't read into it. And I wouldn't read too much into it, but I do think it makes sense to read a little bit into it, given the context that the Cowboys have been particularly quiet this offseason. There's not been a lot of discussion about particular players, slandering players in the media, the ones who, have to negotiate the contracts and things like that. Things that we're used to seeing from the Cowboys by this point in the year haven't been happening. And so I think when you add that to the lack of the presence of the Joneses at a sit down press conference like this one, I feel like it made sense to ask. I think that was a good question from Jane Slater. A lot of people were wondering. So shout out to her for being the one person in the room who actually just addressed the elephant that people were staring at, but nobody wanted to talk about because I guess they were afraid to be wrong. So now that we have that out the way, I was basically listening to this press conference through three different lenses. So one, I was listening for any clues about what Christian Parker might bring to the table, being a branch off the Vic Fangio tree, also being 34 years old. I was also listening for anything that he said specifically regarding coverages and what his scheme might look like. And then I was also listening on his approach to player personalities and the culture, what he's bringing to the table in that regard. And so I have more notes and I have timestamps, but we are going to go through the timestamps and then try to get to the notes. Um, and if you could see this, my notes aren't the most organized. So we're just going to start with what I have as the earliest timestamp, which is about 6 minutes into this particular press conference. And I don't think I have timestamps on here. Let me see.
Could have brought some
Yes,
food,
I did.
Dad.
Okay. But they only come up when the video is playing. So let's go to about here.
People wanted to move forward in the right direction.
Christian, Todd Archer with ESPN. How ready are you for this?
I'm ready.
Where does the confidence come from that you know you're ready to handle?
I think confidence comes from preparation, and I think that I've been able to learn from the right people. So I think that when you've been involved with different people along my journey that I've learned under as head coaches and defensive coordinators, number one, and then the diversity of scheme that I've been involved with, and then you kind of become accustomed to what you're comfortable with in your own ideas. You like certain things, you don't like certain things, what will work, what won't work. I think as you kind of get involved with different people, you kind of form your own identity. So when you have that opportunity, you know what you want to do. And I've kind of gone through that process internally for a great deal of my career. So I've prepared as much as I possibly can at this moment.
So here's what I liked about that answer. Number one, I like the fact that he started off with a blanket, I'm ready. Full stop, did not feel the need to explain, expound, nothing. They said, how ready are you? He said, I'm ready. Basically telling the media that's really all you need to know. But of course they want to know more. So shout out to Todd Archer for that question and for being able to expound on it so quickly, because I think there was an expectation that he would say more. But what I liked about it, beyond him saying that he was ready, I like the fact that he acknowledged what everybody's been talking about, the fact that he's learned from some phenomenal people in the NFL, from some phenomenal coaches, from legends, and I think there are two different types of people when it comes to how that sort of lineage in terms of coaching can be addressed. I think there's a type of person who starts speaking glowingly about who they learn from, and they start listing the people and what they learn from them and how great they are. And then there are people like Christian Parker. And what he did was he didn't name anybody right then, basically sending the signal saying, I'm not bringing up names until y'all bring up names. I know who y'all are probably thinking of. Everybody's talking about Vic Fangio, but he's like, I'll acknowledge that I've learned from some great people. But at the end of the day, emphasis on I've learned. He's talking about the fact that he's learned, the fact that he's taken those opportunities, learning from those great people to form his own identity. He talked about coming up with his own philosophy, his own identity, and being as prepared as possible. And I think that's the most important thing here, because there are some people who will take who they learn from as a resume in itself. Like, I've seen this person, I've watched this person, I've learned from them. Whereas he said, yes, I've learned from them, and this is what I did with that information. I feel prepared. He didn't say I've been taught. He didn't say I watched. He said I feel as prepared as possible. And I think that carries a bit of significance considering how much him being part of the Vic Fangio tree has been overshadowing the conversation of what he's actually going to do with the defense. Because truth be told, we don't know what he's going to do with the defense. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But the reason why we don't know is because it's something that he repeated several times during this press conference, which is the fact that he has to build around the personnel that they have. And they're not done getting the personnel in place, you know? So there are going to be a lot of things that we really won't know until we know. There are going to be a lot of things that they're going to have to figure out. So on that note, let's go to the next timestamp that I have. Do I have 3 more or 4 more? I think I only have 3 more timestamps in here. So the next one is just after this one. And it's where, so in the timestamp in the clip that I'm about to play for you, he talks about 3 things. So this is where he talks about the type of teacher he is. And he used a phrase that I really liked. He said the diversity of teaching. The reason why I really like that is because one thing that doesn't get talked about when we talked about coaches, or it doesn't get talked about enough, it's the fact that when it comes to coaching, teaching is a huge part of coaching. People talk about coming up with the scheme and outsmarting the opposing quarterback. Sometimes you can come up with the best, most brilliant, most innovative scheme. And if you cannot teach it to your players, if you cannot get them to buy in, if you cannot figure out how to make it so that that scheme is second nature to where they know what to do in any situation, it's not going to work, no matter how brilliant it looks on paper. And I like the fact that he mentioned diversity of teaching specifically because of the fact that you need to have a diversity of methods for teaching a diverse group of people. And when you have people of varying ages with different backgrounds and different learning styles, that's exactly what you're dealing with, is a diverse group of people who have to be taught in different ways. So let's listen to what he said specifically about that, and then we can continue talking more about his philosophy. So that's about here.
Together in the next couple months.
John Schotty with The Athletic. Obviously, a big part of your job is teaching. What do you think makes a good teacher?
I think you have to know the student first and foremost. You know, you have to know who you're talking to. What might hit one player's brain is going to hit different than another. So, you know, being thorough and being detailed, being very clear and concise in terms of your messaging, and when to correct, when not to correct. You know, sometimes players got to touch the stove. You just want to do it in a controlled environment. But just how to do that, the diversity of teaching, whether it's on the field, in the meeting room, Kahoot quizzes, physical quizzes, showing them video examples, having them teach it in front of a room. There's so many different ways that you can kind of get in the weeds of teaching: scheme, technique, situational awareness, and really you just want to expose players to as many different examples because it's going to hit everybody differently in terms of how they're able to learn that.
All right, so he talked about the diversity of teaching there, and he also went into different methods that he's going to use while he teaches. So he talks about Kahoot quizzes. He talked about physical quizzes. He talked about one of the things that I liked was that he brought up the fact that some players need to touch the stove. And here's why I like that. There are some coaches and teachers who are so controlling and so strict that they don't even want to let players, they don't even want to let their students touch the stove. And in case you're unfamiliar with that particular reference, touching the stove basically means doing something that you've been coached or taught not to do, but you need to see personally, you need to see firsthand why it doesn't work. And so he acknowledges that, yeah, there are going to be some players who got to touch the stove, but we want to do that in a controlled environment. And I respect that so much more than a coach who just tries to be militant and such a hard ass that he's like, don't touch the fucking stove. It's like, no, that is literally a learning style from some people. And I love the fact that he already has a plan in place for dealing with the type of people who might need to learn that way. And he's not so hard and so strict and so tough that that's going to lead to things like discipline or some sort of punishment or penalties. Because there are some coaches and teachers who will even take that personally. Like, oh, I already said that this doesn't need to happen. I already said don't do this. I already said that this is a bad thing. Why are they trying to do this? Why do they need to learn for themselves? It's called investigation. It's investigation, it's curiosity, it's people who, for whatever reason, they've developed a learning style that means they need to see firsthand what works, what doesn't, and why. And there's really nothing wrong with that. And especially when you have a teacher and a coach who can do that in a controlled environment, then you know that you have an elite learning and teaching environment that he's setting up. And so in the long run, I think what this will lead to is fewer mistakes among the guys on the defense, especially when you have, I feel like when it comes to that type of learning style, athletes, elite athletes, and especially the ones who tend to be more physical and more aggressive, they tend to lean into that learning style anyway. And so I anticipate that we're going to have a situation here where he's able to be a more effective teacher and they're going to be able to be more effective learners because of his flexibility and because of that diversity of teaching. So I'm really excited about what he explained here about his philosophy. All right. The next soundbite that we have is a few minutes after this. Oh, and I do have 5 sound bites. Just one of them I didn't circle. But the next one is a few minutes after this. So in this soundbite, he talked about the diversity of teaching. But then a few minutes later, he talks about schematic versatility. And I really liked what he said here because this is where I think he starts getting into, while he learned from Vic Fangio, he's not Vic Fangio. And he starts to explain a little bit about what his philosophy actually is and what it means for where they are in terms of the process.
Hey Christian, Nick Harris, Forward Star Telegram, congratulations. Obviously your experience is pretty deep. Brian mentioned Vic Fangio, but also Vance Joseph, even Mike Elko. How do you see those guys playing into you building this scheme and call sheet for the first time in your career? And then where do you see your little nuances coming into play as well?
Yeah, a lot of them have a lot of similarities but differences. I think foundationally, Vic, Vance, Mike Pettin, Coach Elko, Gerald Evero all came out of a 3-4 structure. I think that once you get past that, from the fronts you build and the coverages you do and the personality on third down, red zone, you definitely have a mentality as a play caller, but I think that it's still going to be designed around the players that you have. So there's different nuances that I've taken from each one of them. And even people outside of that, as I've had extensive studies and you build relationships outside of the circle you've been in that you want to incorporate with what you want to do.
And then are you more of a guy?
So he used the phrase schematic versatility. And if you listen to everything that he talked about around that, you start to get an idea of what exactly he means by that, where he's discussing the fact that, like, yes, he did develop a certain mentality based on who he was working with, but he also talked to and learned from people who are outside of that immediate circle. But he directly addressed building things around the players that he's working with. And I don't know if this is in one of the sound bites that I wrote down. So I'm going to go ahead and address it. There was a point at which he actually talked about the importance of developing player fit before developing the language that they're going to use, because that seems to be a question every season now because of the fact that there's been a lack of continuity. But he talked about the fact that right now they're in the stage of building the playbook. But even with them building the playbook, the next thing that they're going to have to work on is what they're going to do in terms of player fit. And he even talked at one point about how he wanted there to be diversity in scheme, but he said he wanted that to apply to players in the sense that he wants the players to actually be able to play in multiple schemes and to not be pinned down to playing one style based on what their position is or who they are and what they bring to the table. He wants them to bring multiple things to the table and also to be able to fit into different schemes and in different fronts and coverages. And so there was a point at which he talked about, I think he used the word multiplicity specifically. And so he did say that it's going to be a 3-4 defense by nature. But he also said that we're going to see some 4-3 stuff. And he said we're going to see some 4-2-5 stuff. And so a lot of people, when they're discussing the influence of Vic Fangio, the potential influence of Vic Fangio, there's been a lot of talk about too high safety looks because of how that forces quarterbacks to have to make post-snap reads. And they've talked a lot about the coverages, the emphasis on cover 3 and cover 1 and sometimes cover 6 of Vic Fangio. But in this press conference, what we heard from Christian Parker was him talking about, like, okay, yeah, we're gonna be 3-4 by nature. However, we do want to be able to utilize different looks. And he talked about affecting the quarterback. Actually, I think that's in the next soundbite. So I'm going to go into this, but listen to what he says about affecting the quarterback and how he's not talking about just getting sacks. Listen to all the ways that he says a person or a defense can affect a quarterback and what that looks like to him.
That falls under the line of thinking of building a scheme around the players or acquiring players to fit the scheme?
I think you build it around the players. Of course, you want to have your core principles and foundational beliefs, but as you kind of move forward in the process, what do your guys do well? How can you put good players in highlighted positions? How can you create one-on-ones for certain guys? How you can protect certain guys? If we can win on blitzes on a running back, then we're going to blitz a lot. If we got good man-to-man corners, we're going to play man. If we have guys that are better with zone vision, we're going to play more zone. So, you want to build a package that has diversity and scheme, and then you want to, tailor it to the players that you have. And, of course, there are schematic fits, but I think the really good players are the ones that you can't peg them in a certain scheme, and that's the only way they can play football. You want to have guys that no matter what scheme they're in, they can be significant contributors, and then you want to just highlight it around their strengths.
You mentioned those core beliefs, philosophies. What are those for you, one or two?
Yeah, I think, definitely want to, stop the run and affecting the quarterback, I think, are the two most important things you can do. You affect the quarterback by stopping the run. Sometimes affecting the quarterback comes through pressure. Sometimes it comes through disguise. Sometimes it comes through just the talent that you're able to have and the ability to play, the play style. But I think those two things are where it starts. Because if you can stop the run, you can get teams in predictable downs on second, get back on track, and in third and longs, then you have more schematic versatility. If we're playing a whole bunch of 3rd and 2s and 3rd and 3s, usually those aren't the defenses that are successful.
So that was a section of the press conference where listening to him, it really started to remind me of listening to Brian Schottenheimer talk about offense, because even starting last year, or not last year, but year before last, before Schotty was head coach, people would talk about his press conferences and talk about how you could tell that he just loved the game. He loved ball. He was able to break down the offense, talk about what he was seeing, what made sense, what didn't make sense, what worked, what didn't. And he was using a lot of technical terms, a lot of technical jargon, but he still broke it down in a way that made it easy to digest and easy to understand. And that's what we heard from Christian Parker a lot today, and especially in this section that I just played for you guys, where he talks about affecting the quarterback, and he talks about the multiple ways that you can affect the quarterback: through sacks, through pressures, through throwing them off in terms of timing. He even mentioned that stopping the run is one of the ways that you can affect the quarterback, which is true. And I love that, not just because it shows his own knowledge, but because when applied to a quality defense, what that means is that you're already preparing yourself and preparing the defense to have to deal with multiple different types of offenses and different types of quarterbacks, because we've seen it. Not every quarterback brings the same weapons to the table. There are some guys who are really good with their legs. There are some guys who are really good with the post snap reads. There are some guys who are just like really smart and good at picking apart a defense using a combination of those two things. Shout out to Patrick Mahomes, And so what I'm hearing from him is, hey, not only am I smart, not only do I bring a lot of knowledge to the table, but there's also the fact that I'm prepared to deal with the different offenses and the different types of opponents that the Cowboys are going to have to face. I'm not about to pretend like there's one surefire way to beat all these guys. It might change week to week, but my goal is to make sure that the players are prepared to do whatever they need to do that week in order to beat the opponent. And so I really love that about what he said, and the fact that he wasn't like, because we've heard that in the past, right? DC's coming in and they're like, well, we got to stop the run. We got to stop the run. I like the fact that Christian Parker acknowledged that that is important. However, there are also other things that are important. But what he did align on Schottenheimer, or what he did align with Schottenheimer on, is the fact that everything starts from the line of scrimmage. He said that everything starts up front. And he even acknowledged that the Cowboys have a quality front seven right now in terms of talent. And he also acknowledged that there's some work to do in the parts of the defense behind that front seven, right? But he acknowledged that everything starts up front. He acknowledged that stopping the run is important, but he also acknowledged that there are other ways to affect the QB, and that they absolutely don't want to end up in a lot of short downs and distances. As a matter of fact, I would say that that's probably more significant to what he was saying than what he was saying about stopping the run. And I just like that, because we've seen defensive coordinators of the past emphasize stopping the run. and it didn't really seem to yield the results that Cowboys fans wanted. But this guy's saying, like, yeah, stop the run, all of that, but the real goal is to not end up in a short down and distance. That's the real goal. And I like the fact that he's focused on that particular result. I think that's going to turn into a much better result and a much better product than just obsessing over stopping the run and then not really having a plan for when that doesn't seem to be the most effective way to affect the quarterback that we're dealing with that week. Okay, so that leaves us with one more soundbite that we're going to get into. And so this particular soundbite is where he talks about, he actually specifically addressed the lack of continuity here. And so I want us to listen to what he said, because what I got from this clip that I'm about to play for you guys is that he's acknowledging the shortcomings of last year without being disrespectful. And I think that's important because, of course, you have to acknowledge what did not go well last year. There's some things that are going to have to be fixed, because it's not like they're getting rid of everybody. But he focused more on what he's bringing to the table in terms of fixing that than just saying, like, oh, this is terrible, this is wrong. So let's go ahead and play that one. I think this is a few seconds
Task.
before it.
And I think we've started, but like I said, we're just getting started. And the biggest piece we're in right now, they're getting ready to do playbook, but right now it's personnel driven.
And so the Christian, the part to you in juggling that, and where you've got putting a playbook together, but also evaluations going into the draft. I mean, what are the immediate priorities in terms of, the staff that you brought on board, but then all the other things that are happening going into the draft?
For sure. I think that, it definitely starts with the players. We want to be on the, have a shared vision in terms of what we're looking for, what we're prioritizing. Different positions require different things. I think that the play style that we want to exhibit is crucial. So you want to find players that fit in that mold. And then as we move on, you kind of get into, the offensive language. What are we calling formations and passing concepts and route concepts? And what is our language for tackling and taking the ball away? And then front structures, coverages, the whole nine. You just kind of go through the whole process and take it piece by piece.
On the language, is that something where you use a lot that they've used already, or are you planning on introducing a lot new?
I think you do both. I mean, right now there's not really, the players aren't here consistently to say what they've called different things. I mean, there's been 4 different defenses in the last 4 years, so there's not a lot of continuity relative to that. So I think it starts with, the staff just, we're in the room upstairs, and we kind of start with the foundation of what we want to call things and make sure it's streamlined in a way that's easily digestible for the players, and then you build on that in different realms.
All right, so here's why that soundbite really made my ears perk up, because I feel like it was just a couple of weeks ago that I was talking to you guys about the fact that one of the things that's helped the offense is that they've had the North Star of what's worked for Dak. Because this same question has come up for the offense in terms of what's going to change in terms of the playbook, in terms of the language, in terms of the scheme, in terms of the tendencies, so on and so forth. And they were able to say, well, we want to make sure that certain things work for Dak. And that absolutely made sense. Dak is your quarterback. He's been there for a while. And then there were a couple of other people who had been there for a while. Like in the past, before this last year, there were some offensive linemen who had been there over time. And then you had CeeDee Lamb, who had been an important part of the offense for multiple seasons. So it made sense that they would build on what's already there. But here we see Christian Parker acknowledging what's true, but he already has a plan for it. He says, hey, we haven't had players here to say what they call certain things. And also there's a fact that they've had 4 defenses in the past 4 years. So he says, we're going to start with what makes sense to the coaches. And then we're going to make sure we have a way to teach it to the players and make it easily digestible for them. And I think that is the smartest thing to do in this situation, considering the lack of continuity that the Cowboys defense has had over the past several years. Get the coaches on the same page, because they're the ones who are going to have to teach it. It's very important that there's not a lot of confusion, a lack of clarity back and forth among the coaches that they're bringing in. So he's like, hey, we're going to get the coaches all on the same page, and we're going to teach it to the players. And he already talked earlier in the press conference about his different methods of teaching. So he's already expressed that he's qualified in that regard to make sure that the players are able to learn. He's got various methods in mind for making sure that these players learn what they need to learn. So I really like the fact that he did not stumble through that question, that he didn't shy away from the question, that he was ready for it and had an answer for it. Um, so that's all the timestamps that I have. But some of the other things that I wrote down that we didn't discuss. Well, as a matter of fact, I'm gonna see if I can find this one more timestamp real quick, because it's the one where he actually talked about specifically about the scheme that he wanted to employ. So that was a little bit earlier. Let me see if I can bring that up real quick. That was like actually very early on in the press conference. And I think it's about somewhere in here.
Well, the first thing is we're going to be multiple. I think that whenever you form a defensive structure, it's about the players that you have. So core principles, I mean, will be a 3-4 by nature, but 4-3 spacing will be appropriate. 4-2-5 in nickel, different front structures, coverages behind it. But I would say being multiple is probably the most important thing about it.
All right. So there was laid out. The first thing he said was that they're going to be multiple. He said, 3-4 by nature, but there's going to be 4-3, 4-2-5, different fronts and coverages, but they want to be multiple. So I would say moving forward for the time being, when it comes to people speculating about what CP is going to bring to the table as a defensive coordinator and what his defense might look like, I really think it's safe to say, and I know people are still going to do their think pieces and they're going to do their film reviews about what Vic Fangio did and try to apply it to what they think he's going to do. But one thing that we heard over and over from him was about schematic versatility. He just talked about being multiple. He talked about making sure that things made sense for the players, that the players would be a good fit, So that's why I'm standing firm in the idea that while, hey, some people might guess right and more power to them, but I don't see us being able to predict what this defense is going to look like without the personnel being finalized. Based on what Christian Parker is telling us about his philosophy and what he's going to bring to the table and how he's going to teach this defense, it doesn't make sense for us to be able to predict what this defense is going to look like until we know what the personnel is going to look like. Because for him, that's what comes first. For him, he's got to come up with something that makes sense for the players. And so how then do you reconcile that with the fact that they said that they're working on the playbook now? I think it's important to understand that there's a difference between working on a playbook and knowing what's going to be your default, what's going to be your go-to, what's going to be your bread and butter, right? So he acknowledged that the Cowboys have an excellent front seven. They even asked him about Siobhan Revel and Deron Bland in this press conference, and he even acknowledged the talent that they bring to the table. And I know there are some people who don't like the idea of Siobhan Revel being a Cowboy next year. There was no indication that they were planning on moving on from either of these guys. And when it comes to the logistics of those types of moves, let's just say it's not really something that I think is worth thinking about for Cowboys fans, right? But he acknowledged what each of those guys bring to the table from a very logical standpoint, in my opinion. He talked about the traits that Revel brings to the table, and he talked about Bland being very instinctive. He talked about both of them having to deal with injuries. So I think he's approaching it with a very level-headed view that these guys have a lot to offer, and they're going to need to be used in a certain way, and he's going to have to use some of those diverse teaching methods that he's got in order to get the most out of them. And with it being that, he's made the most out of guys like Quinyon Mitchell and Patrick Surtain II, I think we can definitely trust him to do that. Not saying that these guys are going to turn into those guys, but when it comes to pulling out their full potential, I think we can trust him to do that, right? And so, yeah, Schotty said that they're working on the playbook. That makes sense. But that is not the same thing as knowing what their bread and butter is going to be and what's going to be the default and what are going to be the main things that they rely on, or even what stays in and what goes out. Because what do we hear every year around OTAs, around training camp? They start talking about trimming things down. They start talking about putting certain things in place, adding, taking away. So even though they're working on the bones of the defense right now, that doesn't mean that it won't evolve. That doesn't mean that it won't change by the time the season starts in 6 months from now? Well, it doesn't sound like a lot of time, but it really is. So I would say think of it that way. Yes, they're working on the playbook. There are things that are on the table. However, Christian Parker has made it clear that he's very much trying to fit things around the personnel, that he's a player first guy and wants to do what the players are good at, wants to do what makes sense for the players. So If y'all have any questions or takes, go ahead and put them in the chat. I'm gonna look at what y'all been saying in the chat so far. JV says, I believe in Schotty's vision for the offense and defense, and I believe that Christian Parker believes in that vision as well. 100%. And I will say that's what I like about the visual that we saw at the press conference, even though Schotty said, hey, don't read into the fact that Jerry and Steven aren't here. I think it's still a very good look to see the two of them in a press conference together, talking about the team that they're putting together and what they did to make certain hires. As opposed to what a lot of people seem to predict was that the first several minutes of it were going to be Jerry rambling and answering questions about like George Pickens contract negotiations and stuff that has nothing to do with the Dallas Cowboys defense. And that seems to be the only comment so far today. So, like I said, keep your notifications on because I might go live Friday with some more takeaways from this. Also, apparently there was a lawsuit filed against Rashid Rice. So if I can get my hands on that, we will also talk about that on Friday. But overall, love this press conference. I still love this hire. I'm looking forward to hearing from everybody else on the coaching staff. But this was definitely a press conference that gave me a lot of confidence in Christian Parker and what he's bringing to the table. So thanks, y'all, for joining me. This has been another episode of Bitches Love Sports. I'm your host, Jazz Monet, and I'm out.
You only think of us as a bitches when you intimidated. Put it that way. I think
people look at a woman and she's an aggressive woman who's out to get what she wants to get. You know what I'm saying? Ambitious, and they want to say, you know, when a male is assertive, this is what he wants. He's looked at as a strong male, but yet when I get it, you know, I'm a bitch. Exactly. And if that's what I gotta be, exactly, to get what I want and to make it somewhere, then I'll just be that.